The snow over Stockholm fell in heavy, silent sheets, blanketing the city in a deceptive purity. Inside their warm, minimalist apartment in Ostermalm, Gaius watched his beautiful wife, Leocadia, sleep peacefully, her steady breathing a rhythm he had loved for 5 years. It was a picture of absolute domestic perfection, until the screen of her unattended iPad lit up on the nightstand. It wasn't a late-night hospital emergency. It was a secure, encrypted email from Halcyon, the lead pharmacist at her research trial. The phase 2 numbers are scrubbed, just like you asked. See you at the Grand Hotel tomorrow. I need to taste you again. In a single heartbeat, the warmth of the room vanished, replaced by a freezing, calculated silence. The woman he loved wasn't just breaking his heart, she was breaking the law. If stories of dark secrets, silent revenge, and the heavy price of betrayal speak to you, stay with me. The cold in Stockholm possessed a specific quality in the dead of February. It was a heavy, suffocating chill that seemed to seep through the triple-glazed windows of the luxury apartments in Ostermalm. Inside, however, the climate was always controlled, always perfect. Gaius sat on the edge of the custom-made king bed, the thick down comforter pooling around his waist. The digital clock on the bedside table read 2:14 a.m. Beside him, Leocadia breathed in a soft, rhythmic cadence. Her dark hair was splayed across the stark white pillowcases, her face relaxed into an expression of utter innocence. She had come home late from the hospital, blaming a grueling rotation and a demanding supervisor. Gaius, the ever-supportive husband, had rubbed her tired shoulders, drawn her a hot bath, and listened to her complain about the endless bureaucratic tape at Nordic Biopharma. He hadn't been looking for trouble. He had only reached across her to grab his phone to check the time in Tokyo, calculating the window for a morning conference call with a supplier for his medical device manufacturing firm. In doing so, his knuckles brushed the screen of Leocadia's iPad, which rested precariously on the edge of her nightstand. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale glow over the darkened room. Gaius was about to press the power button to plunge the room back into darkness when a banner notification dropped down from the top of the locked screen. It wasn't a standard hospital page. It was from a secure, encrypted messaging app he didn't even know she had installed. The sender's name was simply listed as H. He froze. The stillness of the room suddenly felt less like peace and more like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen from his lungs. The phase 2 numbers are scrubbed, just like you asked. See you at the Grand Hotel tomorrow at 4. I need to taste you again. The words hung in the digital glare, a brief flash of neon poison, before the screen went dark again. For a long moment, Gaius didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just stared at the blank, black rectangle of glass. H. Halcyon, the brilliant, charismatic lead pharmacist who had recently transferred from the London branch to spearhead Leocadia's clinical trial. The man she had described just hours ago over dinner as brilliant but hopelessly disorganized. A slow, icy dread began to coil in Gaius's stomach. The betrayal of the flesh, I need to taste you again, was a sharp, agonizing blade sliding between his ribs. But it was the first sentence that twisted the knife, jagged and cruel. The phase 2 numbers are scrubbed. Gaius was an engineer. He understood data. He understood clinical trials. Scrubbed numbers didn't mean cleaned or formatted. In the context of a highly volatile new cardiovascular drug, it meant erased, altered, falsified. He looked down at his wife. The woman he had married 5 years ago in a small chapel in Uppsala. The woman who had sworn an oath to do no harm. She was sleeping soundly, a faint, contented smile playing on her lips. She wasn't just breaking their vows. She was conspiring to push a potentially dangerous drug onto the market. She was risking lives for prestige and sleeping with the man helping her do it. A lesser man might have shaken her awake. He might have screamed, demanded answers, thrown the tablet against the pristine white walls. Gaius felt that urge, a primal, violent surge of rage that made his hands tremble. But as he looked at the soft curve of her neck, the analytical side of his brain, the engineer that built life-saving machines out of cold metal and logic, engaged. Confronting her now would only result in tears, denials, and deleted evidence. She would twist the narrative. She would paint him as paranoid. Slowly, carefully, Gaius pulled his hand back. He lay down on the mattress, turning his back to her. He stared into the absolute darkness of the room, his heart hammering a frantic, erratic beat against his sternum. She thought he was the dependable, predictable husband, a safe harbor she could return to after her thrilling storms. She thinks I am clueless, Gaius thought, the realization settling over him like a shroud of ice. He closed his eyes, but sleep was 1,000 miles away. The game had changed, and the rules were no longer written in love, but in blood and data. Morning came with the slow, reluctant grayness typical of a Stockholm winter. The sun was merely a pale suggestion behind a thick wall of clouds. Gaius was already awake. In truth, he had not slept a single minute. He stood in the kitchen, the stainless steel espresso machine hissing and spitting dark liquid into 2 porcelain cups. The rich smell of roasted beans, usually a comforting anchor to his mornings, now made him faintly nauseous. He heard the soft padding of bare feet against the heated oak floors. Leocadia emerged from the hallway, wrapped in his oversized gray cashmere sweater. It was a domestic image so familiar, so previously endearing, that the sight of her felt like a physical blow to his chest. "Morning, Alskling," she murmured, her voice husky with sleep. She stepped close, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind and pressing her cheek against his shoulder blade. Every muscle in Gaius's body locked. His instinct screamed at him to shove her away, to demand what scrubbed numbers meant, to ask how Halcyon tasted. The phantom heat of her touch felt like a violation. Instead, he forced a slow, measured breath into his lungs. He reached back, patting her hand lightly. "Morning," he said, his voice remarkably steady. The engineer in him was taking over, compartmentalizing the trauma, treating his own mind like a complex machine that needed to function despite a critical error in its central software. He handed her a cup of coffee. She took it with a grateful smile, leaning casually against the marble kitchen island. "You look exhausted," she noted, her brow furrowing in a display of concern that made Gaius's stomach churn. "Just thinking about the Tokyo shipment," he lied smoothly. It was terrifying how easily the deception came to him. A dark mirror reflecting her own. "Big day for you." Leocadia blew on her coffee, her gaze shifting slightly toward the frosted window. It was a microscopic tell, a tiny hesitation he would have never noticed yesterday. Just the usual grind at Nordic Bio. Halcyon wants to run through the Phase 2 analytics again. The board is breathing down our necks for the preliminary safety report. Safety report. The words tasted like ash in the dry air of the kitchen. "He seems like a demanding boss," Gaius offered, turning around to face her fully. He leaned against the counter, keeping his posture open, mild, the absolute picture of a supportive partner. "He is," Leocadia sighed, rolling her eyes in a practiced gesture of professional exasperation. "He's brilliant, but God, he's exhausting. I might be late tonight, Gaius. We have a massive amount of data to compile before the European Medical Conference next month. See you at the Grand Hotel tomorrow at 4. The encrypted message flashed violently in Gaius's mind, overlaying his wife's beautiful, lying face. She wasn't compiling data tonight. She was erasing it, hiding fatal flaws in a cardiovascular drug, and then she was going to a luxury hotel room to celebrate her crimes. "Don't push yourself too hard," Gaius said softly, stepping forward to press a kiss to her forehead. Her skin was warm. It felt like burning plastic against his lips. "The trial will be a success. You've worked too hard for it not to be." "You always know what to say," she smiled, standing on her tiptoes to kiss him properly on the mouth. He allowed it, keeping his eyes open, studying the delicate fluttering of her eyelashes. She was a phenomenal actress, but she had grossly underestimated her audience. As she turned and walked toward the bathroom to shower, humming a quiet tune, Gaius picked up a dish towel and methodically wiped down the spotless marble counter. The perfect mask was firmly in place. Let her have her afternoon at the Grand Hotel. Let her think she was the smartest person in the room. He had a different kind of data to compile, and his timeline for total destruction had just begun. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing Leocadia out in the freezing Stockholm morning. Gaius stood perfectly still in the foyer for exactly 10 minutes, listening to the silence of the empty apartment. Once he was certain she had descended to the parking garage, the facade dropped entirely. The mild, supportive husband vanished, replaced by the precise, methodical engineer. He walked into his home office, a sleek room dominated by a massive L-shaped desk and 3 high-resolution monitors. While Leocadia had taken her iPad, she had left her secondary work laptop, a machine she occasionally used for remote data entry, docked on the living room console. He brought it into his office and set it down like a live explosive. Gaius knew her standard passwords. They were variations of their anniversary and the name of the street where they first met. But a woman hiding a federal crime and a lover wouldn't use those for her darkest secrets. Booting the laptop in a localized safe mode, Gaius inserted a specialized USB drive he typically used for penetration testing the firmware of his own company's medical devices. Within minutes, he bypassed the local administrator lock. He wasn't a professional hacker, but he understood network architecture and digital infrastructure far better than a pharmacist or a resident doctor ever could. The real challenge was the Nordic Biopharma VPN. Leocadia's laptop had a saved security token for remote access. Gaius activated it, holding his breath as the connection established. If Halcyon or the IT department had set up real-time monitoring for the trial database, Gaius's IP address might flag as an anomaly. The risk of federal espionage charges hung heavily in the sterile air of his office, but the image of Leocadia smiling over a cup of coffee pushed him forward. He bypassed her standard inbox and dug into the hidden, partition drive he located through the laptop's command terminal. There, buried under layers of innocuous system files, he found a folder simply titled Archive_H. His heart thudded a heavy, dull rhythm against his ribs as he cracked the folder's local encryption using a brute force script. It took 20 agonizing minutes of watching lines of code cascade down his screen. When the lock finally broke, a sprawling directory of spreadsheets and PDF reports spilled open. Gaius opened 2 files side by side on his dual monitors. On the left was the raw, unedited clinical data from the Phase 2 cardiovascular trial. On the right was the polished draft report Halcyon was preparing for the European Medical Board. The engineer's eye scanned the columns. It did not take a medical degree to understand the horror laid out in the numbers. In the raw data, patient 402 and patient 415 showed critically elevated troponin levels and instances of ventricular fibrillation, microheart attacks. On the right side, in Halcyon's report, those severe cardiac events had been completely erased. They were reclassified as mild, anxiety-induced palpitations, or blamed on pre-existing conditions that the patients supposedly failed to disclose. Leocadia, a doctor sworn to protect human life, was digitally signing off on the alterations. She was providing the medical justification to hide a fatal flaw in a drug that would soon be pumped into the veins of thousands of unsuspecting patients. Gaius leaned back in his ergonomic chair, the cold glow of the monitors painting his pale face in hues of blue and white. The affair was a knife to his heart, but this was a monstrosity. Halcyon and Leocadia were not just cheating lovers. They were architects of a mass casualty event, driven by greed and the promise of pharmaceutical prestige. He began to quietly, methodically copy every single file onto an encrypted external hard drive. He was no longer just a husband seeking a divorce. He was compiling a death warrant for 2 careers, and he would not stop until he had buried them both under the weight of their own fabricated data. The Grand Hotel stood in monumental, pale yellow splendor against the icy waters of Stromkagen, a luxury landmark wrapped in the frozen grip of Stockholm's winter. At 3:45 p.m., Gaius was already there, but not inside. He sat across the wide boulevard in a small, unremarkable cafe, nursing a bitter espresso he hadn't touched. He wore a dark, heavy wool coat and a simple black scarf pulled high over his jaw, blending perfectly into the late afternoon rush of tourists and business professionals escaping the cold. His eyes never left the hotel's ornate revolving doors. The engineer in him had calculated the odds of Leocadia spotting him as nearly zero, given her preoccupation, but his heart still hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. The digital betrayal of the tablet and the horror of the falsified data on the Nordic Bio server were abstract, cold things. This, waiting to see the woman he loved walk into a hotel with another man, was visceral, bleeding reality. At exactly 4:02 p.m., a Blacktown car pulled up to the curb. Gaius's breath hitched, fogging the cafe window. Leocadia stepped out. She wore the elegant emerald green coat he had bought her for their 3rd anniversary. Her dark hair was immaculately styled, her posture confident and relaxed. She didn't look like a woman burdened by the guilt of destroying her marriage or the terrifying weight of covering up a deadly clinical trial. She looked radiant, practically glowing with anticipation. A moment later, a man exited the hotel's grand entrance to meet her on the sidewalk. Gaius felt the air leave his lungs in a sharp, painful rush. It was Halcyon. He recognized the man from the brief, awkward introduction at a Nordic Bio holiday party months ago. Halcyon was tall, sharp-featured, exuding an effortless, arrogant charm in a tailored navy suit that likely cost more than Gaius's first car. What broke Gaius wasn't the sight of the man, but the immediate, electric change in Leocadia's demeanor. As Halcyon approached, she didn't offer a professional handshake or a polite nod. Her face broke into a dazzling, intimate smile, a smile Gaius hadn't seen directed at him in over a year. Halcyon didn't hesitate. Right there on the busy street, in broad daylight, he reached out and caught Leocadia by the waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He leaned down, and she tilted her head up eagerly, their lips meeting in a deep, hungry kiss that spoke of profound familiarity and long-held desire. It wasn't a stolen peck. It was a brazen claim of ownership. Gaius's hands tightened around his cold espresso cup until his knuckles turned white, the ceramic threatening to shatter under the pressure. The nausea that had been a dull ache all day suddenly flared into a violent, churning sickness in his stomach. He watched his wife, the woman he had built a life with, the woman he had trusted implicitly, melt into the arms of a man she was conspiring with to commit mass medical fraud. He could have crossed the street. He could have marched up to them, ripped Halcyon away, and screamed his fury into the freezing Stockholm air. The impulse was a roaring fire in his chest, demanding immediate, violent catharsis. But as Halcyon's hand slid possessively down Leocadia's back to guide her through the revolving doors and into the luxurious depths of the hotel, Gaius forced himself to remain seated. He closed his eyes, visualizing the downloaded patient files on his encrypted hard drive, the erased micro-heart attacks, the scrubbed ventricular fibrillation data. The phase 2 numbers are scrubbed. He opened his eyes, the roaring fire in his chest hardening into a cold, unbreakable diamond of resolve. He didn't want a messy, emotional confrontation on a sidewalk. He wanted absolute, calculated annihilation. He watched the revolving doors spin empty, pulling his scarf tighter against the cold. They were checking into a luxury suite to celebrate their secrets, completely unaware that the architect of their total destruction was sitting quietly just across the street, watching the hourglass of their careers and their freedom slowly run out. The apartment in Ostermalm was a tomb of silence when Gaius returned. The faint scent of Leocadia's expensive floral perfume still lingered in the hallway, a cloying reminder of the woman currently entangled with another man at the Grand Hotel. He stripped off his heavy coat, ignoring the chill that had settled deep into his bones, and walked straight back to his home office. The encrypted hard drive sat on his desk, an unassuming black rectangle holding enough explosive data to level Nordic Bio Pharma and send his wife to federal prison. Gaius sat down, the soft hum of his desktop tower the only sound in the room. He booted up the secure partition he had created and opened the raw data files from the Phase 2 trial. He wasn't a doctor, but his engineering background in medical device calibration required a strong understanding of physiological metrics, particularly cardiovascular telemetry. He knew what a healthy heart rate looked like. He knew what an impending catastrophic failure looked like. He spent the next 3 hours poring over the unedited patient logs. The drug, codenamed Ethelgard, was designed to regulate chronic hypertension without the fatigue associated with beta blockers. According to Halcyon's polished, scrubbed reports, it was a miracle, a sleek, flawless solution poised to dominate the European market. But the raw numbers painted a terrifying, bloody picture. Gaius highlighted rows of data, his jaw tight. Patient 402, a 60-year-old male, had experienced a severe spike in troponin levels, a key indicator of heart muscle damage, just 48 hours after the second dosage. Patient 415, a 55-year-old female, had suffered a terrifying 6-second burst of ventricular fibrillation, a chaotic, potentially fatal heart rhythm. In Halcyon's final draft, these events were meticulously erased. Patient 402's troponin spike was reclassified as a minor lab error, and patient 415's fibrillation was noted as patient-reported anxiety, no clinical significance. Leocadia, as the lead medical resident on the trial, had signed her digital authorization on every single altered page. She had provided the medical justification to hide the poison in the pill. Gaius rubbed his temples, a dull, throbbing headache building behind his eyes. He imagined the thousands of people who would take Ethelgard, trusting the brilliant minds at Nordic Biopharma, trusting doctors like his wife. He pictured the sudden, inexplicable heart attacks, the grieving families. The urge to pick up the phone and call the Swedish Medical Products Agency was overwhelming. It would be the righteous, immediate thing to do. An anonymous tip, a dropped flash drive, and the trial would be halted by morning. But as he hovered his mouse over the print icon, a dark, vindictive rage clawed its way up his throat. If he reported it anonymously now, Nordic Bio's massive legal team would swoop in. They would bury the investigation in red tape. Halcyon and Leocadia would claim ignorance, blame a rogue data entry clerk, or simply resign quietly with massive severance packages, free to continue their affair and their careers elsewhere. No, Gaius thought, the word echoing loudly in the sterile quiet of his office. No quiet exits. No severance packages. He needed an execution, not an investigation. He needed a stage so public, so undeniable, that no corporate lawyer could save them. He needed the European Medical Conference next month, where Halcyon and Leocadia were scheduled to present Ethelgard to the world's leading cardiologists and investors as their crowning achievement. Gaius began compiling a master folder. He placed the raw, deadly data side by side with the falsified reports. He pulled the encrypted emails from Leocadia's iPad, the digital trail of their affair and their conspiracy. He was no longer just building a divorce case. He was crafting a guillotine, meticulously sharpening the blade with every line of code, preparing to drop it on the two people who believed they were untouchable. The front door of the apartment clicked open, the sound echoing sharply down the hall. Leocadia was home. Gaius minimized the folders, locked the partition, and forced his face into a mask of mild, loving indifference before she could even reach the office doorway. The show had to go on. The dinner party was Leocadia's idea. A brilliant, calculated move to normalize her relationship with her superior, or perhaps just a cruel, arrogant game she was playing with her own marriage. She had casually mentioned over morning coffee that Halcyon was practically living at the Nordic Biolabs, stressed over the upcoming European conference, and that a home-cooked meal would be a great way to foster a good working relationship. Gaius had smiled, the perfect, supportive husband, and agreed. He had spent the entire afternoon preparing a complex, slow-roasted lamb, a dish that required hours of meticulous attention, the kind of attention he was currently devoting to the destruction of his wife's life. When the doorbell rang at 7:30 p.m., Gaius was pouring a heavy, decanted Barolo into crystal glasses. Leocadia rushed to the door, her cheeks flushed with an excitement that made Gaius's stomach turn to ice. "Halcyon, thank you so much for coming," she beamed, taking his coat. Halcyon stepped into the foyer of the Ostermom apartment, bringing with him the sharp, cold scent of the Stockholm night and a subtle, expensive cologne that Gaius immediately recognized from the collar of Leocadia's emerald coat 3 days prior. He looked even more striking up close. Sharp jaw, piercing blue eyes, an aura of supreme, unshakable confidence. Leocadia, Gaius, it's a pleasure, Halcyon said smoothly, offering Gaius a firm, professional handshake. Thank you for the invitation. The food smells incredible. I rarely get a home-cooked meal these days, stuck between the lab and the hotel. The word hotel hung in the air for a fraction of a second. Gaius met Halcyon's gaze, his expression completely blank, forcing a polite, welcoming smile. We're glad you could make it, Halcyon, Gaius said smoothly, handing him a glass of wine. Leocadia tells me you're working miracles with the Ethelgard trial. It's all she talks about. She's too modest, Halcyon chuckled, taking a sip of the Barolo. He glanced at Leocadia, a fleeting, intimate look that communicated volumes of shared secrets. She's the real star. Her clinical insights are indispensable. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological torture. Gaius sat at the head of the long, oak dining table, the architect of a slow, agonizing execution, playing the role of the affable host. He carved the lamb with surgical precision, serving generous portions to his wife and the man she was sleeping with. The conversation flowed effortlessly around him. Halcyon was articulate, charming, and deeply narcissistic, holding court on the complexities of cardiovascular pharmacology. Leocadia leaned forward, her eyes bright, hanging on to his every word. Gaius watched them over the rim of his wine glass, observing the microscopic details of their interaction. The way Halcyon's knee subtly brushed against Leocadia's under the table. The way she laughed a little too quickly at his jokes. The way their eyes met when Gaius turned away to refill a water glass. They were so confident in his ignorance. They believed him to be a simple, predictable engineer, a comfortable safety net while they played God with medical data and each other's bodies. So, Gaius, Halcyon said, suddenly turning his attention to him, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. Leocadia mentions you design medical devices. Pacemakers, isn't it? Telemetry systems, mostly. Gaius replied evenly, slicing into his lamb. Monitoring algorithms. We build the software that catches anomalies the human eye might miss. Halcyon raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine interest crossing his arrogant features. Fascinating. So you deal primarily with raw data? Exactly, Gaius said, looking up, holding Halcyon's gaze for a long, heavy moment. He let a small, tight smile touch the corners of his mouth. Raw data is my specialty. It's always the most honest part of the process. You can dress up a report, Halcyon, but you can't argue with the numbers. If there's a flaw in the system, the data always reveals it eventually. Leocadia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, a sudden, inexplicable tension tightening her shoulders. She glanced nervously at Halcyon, who merely chuckled, taking another sip of wine. A very engineering perspective, Halcyon conceded smoothly. In pharmacology, however, data often requires interpretation, nuance. We have to look at the bigger picture, the overall benefit to the patient population, rather than getting bogged down by statistical noise. Statistical noise. The words echoed in Gaius's mind, overlaying the image of patient 415's fatal ventricular fibrillation. A woman's heart failing, written off as an acceptable margin of error. Of course, Gaius agreed softly, raising his glass in a mock toast. To the bigger picture, then. He drank the dark wine, feeling it burn a path down his throat. The dinner continued, the conversation steering away from the dangerous waters of clinical trials. But Gaius had planted his seed. He sat back, watching them bask in their shared brilliance and their illicit romance, knowing with absolute certainty that the countdown to their total annihilation had begun. The European conference was exactly 2 weeks away, and Gaius was going to deliver a presentation they would never forget. The 2 weeks leading up to the European Cardiovascular Summit were a masterclass in psychological endurance. Gaius operated on a terrifyingly calm frequency, an engineer entirely consumed by the mechanics of his final project. The apartment in Ostermalm remained pristine. Dinner was always ready, and he continued to play the role of the devoted husband with sickening perfection. Leocadia was a bundle of nervous, manic energy. The pressure of the impending conference, combined with the immense weight of the fabricated Ethelgard data, was beginning to show. She snapped at small things, a misplaced coffee cup, a delayed text, and spent hours locked in her home office, communicating via encrypted channels with Halcyon. Gaius watched her unraveling with a cold, detached fascination. She was a woman standing on a trapdoor she had built herself, entirely unaware that her husband was holding the lever. His own preparations required absolute secrecy and meticulous execution. While Leocadia slept, exhausted from her dual life, Gaius retreated to his office. He had successfully mirrored her primary work laptop's hard drive during the dinner party, using a discrete network tap, while she and Halcyon were distracted by dessert. It was a massive risk, but it had yielded everything he needed. He sat before his 3 monitors, the harsh blue light illuminating the dark circles under his eyes. On the center screen, he had the official Nordic Biopharma presentation file, a sleek, heavily branded PowerPoint that Halcyon intended to use to dazzle the European Medical Board. It was a masterpiece of corporate deception, full of rising graphs and glowing patient testimonials, completely scrubbed of the fatal cardiac events. On the left screen, Gaius had the raw data logs, the undeniable proof of patient 402's troponin spike and patient 415's ventricular fibrillation. On the right screen, he had the encrypted email archive. He didn't just want to expose the medical fraud. He wanted to demonstrate the precise motive behind it. The affair was the catalyst. The arrogance and the lust for prestige were the fuel. Gaius began to write a custom script, embedding a hidden executable file within the structure of Halcyon's PowerPoint. He wasn't simply replacing slides. He was designing a hostile takeover of the presentation software. When triggered, his code would seamlessly hijack the display, pulling data directly from the encrypted archive he planned to hide on the conference center's local network. He worked methodically, his fingers flying across the keyboard in the silent apartment. He synchronized the timing perfectly. Slide 14 of Halcyon's presentation was the critical moment, the slide titled Unprecedented Safety Profile. This was where Halcyon would arrogantly declare Ethelgard a miracle drug, devoid of severe side effects. Gaius programmed his script to execute precisely when Halcyon clicked to slide 14. Instead of the scrubbed, safe data, the screen would violently glitch. It would pull up the raw, terrifying EKG readouts of patient 415's failing heart. But Gaius didn't stop there. He wanted the board to understand why those numbers had been erased. Overlaid on the erratic, dying heart rhythms, he programmed the script to flash the encrypted messages. The phase 2 numbers are scrubbed, just like you asked. I can't believe we pulled this off. The board will eat it up. See you at the Grand Hotel. I need to taste you again. He linked the messages directly to the timestamps of the data alterations, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence connecting the sexual affair to the clinical fraud. It was a brutal, undeniable narrative. By 4 a.m. on the Thursday before the conference, the script was finished. Gaius ran a simulation on a virtual machine, watching the sterile corporate presentation dissolve into a terrifying montage of medical malpractice and infidelity. It was flawless. It was devastating. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his burning eyes. A profound, icy exhaustion settled over him. He had spent weeks living with a ghost, a woman he no longer recognized, building a weapon designed to destroy her. He locked the partition on his hard drive and shut down the computers. As he walked back to the master bedroom, he paused in the doorway, looking at Leocadia's sleeping form. She looked small, fragile, entirely unaware of the storm gathering over her head. For a fleeting, painful second, the man who had loved her wanted to wake her up, to shake her, to demand she stop this madness before it was too late. But then he remembered the raw data. He remembered the lives she was willing to sacrifice for a promotion and a hotel room key. The moment of weakness passed, replaced by the cold, unforgiving logic of the engineer. The trap was set. All that remained was for them to walk onto the stage. The night before the European Cardiovascular Summit settled over Stockholm like a physical weight. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet, save for the soft hum of the central heating and the frantic tapping of Leocadia's manicured nails against her laptop keyboard at the dining table. She was rehearsing her talking points, surrounded by glossy Nordic biopharma pamphlets and half-empty cups of espresso. Gaius sat on the sofa, a book open in his lap, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. He was watching her, dissecting her every movement. Tomorrow, she would stand on a stage and lie to the world, securing her career and signing the death warrants of innocent patients. At 11:30 p.m., she finally closed her laptop with a soft, exhausted sigh. She stood up, stretching her arms overhead, the tension radiating from her stiff shoulders. She walked over to the sofa and practically collapsed next to him, resting her head against his chest. Gaius didn't move. He let her settle there, the warmth of her body a stark contrast to the ice running through his veins. "It's finally happening," she murmured, her voice thick with fatigue and barely suppressed excitement. "Tomorrow. After all this time, all these late nights." "Are you ready?" Gaius asked, his voice deliberately neutral, keeping his eyes fixed on the blank wall opposite them. She shifted, looking up at him. Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were soft, almost vulnerable. It was a terrifyingly good performance, or perhaps, in some twisted way, she actually believed the narrative she had constructed. "I am," she said softly. She reached up, her hand gently tracing the line of his jaw. "But I couldn't have done it without you, Gaius. Seriously. I know I've been a nightmare these past few months. The stress, the hours. I haven't been a good wife." The hypocrisy of the statement was a physical blow, a sickening punch to the gut. Gaius felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. He forced himself to breathe slowly, evenly. "You've been focused," he managed to say, the words tasting like ash. "You're doing important work. Important work. Scrubbing data. Hiding heart failures. Fucking Halcyon at the Grand Hotel." "I am," she agreed, missing the irony completely. She smiled, a sad, weary expression. "But after tomorrow, it's done. We launch Phase 3, and I can finally breathe. We can take that trip to Italy we talked about. Just the two of us. We need to reconnect." Gaius looked down at her. The woman who had sworn to love him, who was currently planning a romantic getaway with the husband she was betraying daily. He searched her eyes for any hint of guilt, any flicker of the monster he knew was hiding beneath the beautiful surface. There was nothing, just the calm, sociopathic confidence of someone who believed they had successfully manipulated every variable in their life. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, the protective shell he had built around his heart cracked. A wave of profound, suffocating grief washed over him. He mourned the woman he thought he had married. He mourned the future they had planned. He mourned the simple, naive happiness he had felt just a month ago, before he saw the encrypted message on her iPad. His hand moved almost involuntarily, coming to rest lightly on her hair. He felt a desperate urge to ask her why. Why Halcyon? Why the fraud? Was he not enough? Was their life so mundane that she needed to burn it down for the thrill of a secret? But he swallowed the questions. Asking why implied he still cared about her answers. He didn't. He only cared about the data. He only cared about stopping the poison she was about to release into the world. "Italy sounds nice," he lied, his voice barely a whisper. Leocadia smiled, closing her eyes and snuggling closer. "I love you, Gaius." He didn't say it back. He couldn't. He simply held her as she drifted off to sleep against his chest, her breathing evening out into a peaceful rhythm. Gaius remained awake, staring into the dark apartment until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the windows. The grief had passed, replaced entirely by a cold, surgical resolve. The trial was over. The verdict was set. He gently untangled himself from her embrace, leaving her sleeping on the sofa. He walked into the bathroom, turned on the harsh fluorescent lights, and looked at himself in the mirror. He was no longer the supportive husband. He was the executioner. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, encrypted USB drive containing the self-executing script. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the cold metal edges. The numbers never lie, Leocadia. Neither do I. The Stockholm Waterfront Congress Center was a chaotic hive of ambition and pharmaceutical money. The vast glass and steel structure buzzed with thousands of cardiologists, investors, and researchers, all seeking the next major breakthrough. Gaius walked through the crowded atrium, his hand resting lightly on the small of Leocadia's back. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the epitome of the successful, supportive spouse. Leocadia was electric. She wore a sharp, navy blue pantsuit that commanded authority, her lanyard displaying the coveted keynote speaker badge. She was fielding handshakes and brief, enthusiastic conversations with colleagues, her smile a practiced weapon of charm. Gaius, I need to check in with the PR team before we head into Hall A, she said, her voice tight with adrenaline. She squeezed his arm, a gesture of faux intimacy that made his stomach knot. Halcyon is already backstage. Take your time, Gaius replied smoothly, offering a reassuring smile. I'll go find our seats. Do you need me to double-check the slides with the AV tech? You mentioned the embedded video was lagging yesterday. It was a calculated lie, a seed planted days ago during a casual dinner conversation. Leocadia's brow furrowed slightly, a flash of anxiety breaking her confident facade. God. Yes, please, she practically breathed, clearly relieved to offload a logistical headache. The tech booth is at the back of the main auditorium. Just make sure the final version labeled Ethelgard_launch_v final is loaded on the primary drive. Thank you, Alskling. She kissed his cheek, a quick, dismissive brush of lips, and hurried off toward a cluster of Nordic bio executives. Gaius watched her go, his expression hardening the moment she turned away. The supportive husband vanished, replaced by the precise, methodical engineer. He navigated the dense crowd, his eyes fixed on the towering double doors of Hall A. The auditorium was massive, capable of holding over 2,000 people. The stage was set with a sleek podium and 3 gargantuan LED screens. He slipped into the cavernous room, currently half full as attendees found their seats. The AV booth was an elevated, glass-enclosed structure at the very back. Gaius approached it with a calm, purposeful stride, projecting the aura of someone who absolutely belonged there. Inside the booth, 2 technicians were frantically communicating over headsets, surrounded by a complex array of soundboards and laptops. Excuse me, Gaius said, raising his voice slightly over the ambient noise. He held up his guest of speaker badge. I'm Gaius, Dr. Leocadia's husband. She asked me to verify the slide transitions on the Ethelgard presentation. We had some latency issues during rehearsal. The older technician, a harried-looking man with a clipboard, sighed heavily. We've already run the diagnostics, sir. The file is solid on the primary server. I understand, Gaius said, his tone perfectly balancing professional courtesy with the firm authority of a VIP's spouse. But my wife is quite particular. She just wants to be certain the localized copy on the podium laptop is synced. It will only take a moment. The technician hesitated, glancing at the clock. The presentation was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. He waved a dismissive hand toward a secondary laptop docked near the soundboard. Fine, but make it quick. We go live at 10 sharp. Gaius stepped up to the machine. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but his hands were terrifyingly steady. He pulled the small, encrypted USB drive from his breast pocket. The drive contained the self-executing script he had spent weeks perfecting. He inserted the drive into the laptop's port. The system pinged, recognizing the new hardware. Gaius's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard presentation software. He located the file titled Ethelgard_launch_v final, PPTX. With a few rapid keystrokes, he didn't delete it. He simply changed the file path. When Halcyon clicked to start the presentation on the podium, the system wouldn't pull the polished, scrubbed Nordic bio file. It would pull Gaius's executable script from the hidden partition on the server, disguised under the exact same file name. It took exactly 45 seconds. Everything looks perfect, Gaius announced cheerfully, ejecting his USB drive and slipping it back into his pocket. Smooth transitions. Thank you for your time. The technician grunted, already focused back on his monitors. Gaius stepped out of the booth, the heavy glass doors sealing shut behind him. The deed was done. The digital guillotine was primed. He walked down the carpeted aisle, taking a seat in the second row, directly in the center. He crossed his legs, resting his hands casually in his lap, and waited for his wife and her lover to walk onto the stage and execute themselves. The house lights in Hall A of the Stockholm Waterfront Congress Center dimmed precisely at 10 a.m. A hushed anticipation fell over the 2,000 cardiologists, investors, and pharmaceutical executives packed into the auditorium. The low hum of whispered conversations died instantly as the towering LED screens flared to life, displaying the sleek, minimalist Nordic Biopharma logo in stark white against a deep blue background. Gaius sat perfectly still in the second row, his expression an unreadable mask of polite interest. He didn't look at the screen, he looked at the stage. Halcyon walked out first, exuding the predatory confidence of a man about to conquer the medical world. He wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit that perfectly tailored to his arrogant posture. Leocadia followed a half-step behind, radiant in her navy pantsuit, her smile bright and practiced. They stood together at the sleek glass podium, a vision of professional synergy and hidden sin. "Welcome, distinguished colleagues," Halcyon began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system, smooth and authoritative. "Today, we are not merely presenting a new pharmaceutical. We are presenting a paradigm shift in cardiovascular care." Leocadia took the microphone, her eyes scanning the front rows until she found Gaius. She offered him a small, intimate smile, a silent thank you for his unwavering support. Gaius did not return the smile. He simply blinked, a cold, reptilian stare that caused a fleeting shadow of confusion to cross her flawless face before she turned back to the audience. "For the past 3 years," Leocadia continued, her voice clear and professional, "our team at Nordic Bio has meticulously analyzed the Phase 2 clinical data for Ethelgard. We sought a solution for chronic hypertension that eliminated the debilitating fatigue associated with current beta blockers. The results, as you will see, have exceeded our most optimistic projections." Halcyon stepped forward, taking control of the presentation remote. "Let us look at the data." He clicked the button. The screen behind them shifted from the Nordic Bio logo to the first slide, a polished graph showing a dramatic decrease in blood pressure across a wide patient demographic. The audience murmured in appreciation. Halcyon clicked again. Slide 2. Slide 3. Each transition was smooth, professional, and entirely fabricated. Gaius checked his watch. It was 10:04 a.m. Slide 14 was approaching. "But efficacy is only half the battle," Halcyon declared, his voice rising in a practiced crescendo of triumph. "The true triumph of Ethelgard lies in its unprecedented safety profile. Our extensive trials have demonstrated a near-total absence of severe cardiac events. The data is, quite frankly, flawless." He raised the remote with a theatrical flourish and clicked to slide 14. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second, a microscopic delay as Gaius's executable script hijacked the server connection. Then, the polished graph vanished. The massive LED screens violently glitched, flashing a blinding, erratic strobe of raw code before stabilizing on a completely different image. It wasn't a graph. It was a raw, unedited EKG readout. The jagged green lines spiked wildly, an undeniable visual representation of a heart tearing itself apart. In massive, bold, red letters across the top of the screen, the text read, "Patient 415, ventricular fibrillation, fatal arrhythmia event." A collective gasp ripped through the auditorium. 2,000 medical professionals instantly recognized the terrifying reality of the data displayed before them. Halcyon froze, his arrogant smile sliding off his face like melted wax. He clicked the remote frantically, his thumb jabbing the button repeatedly. The slide did not change. "There seems to be a technical error," Halcyon stammered, his voice losing its smooth authority, cracking slightly over the PA system. He looked wildly toward the AV booth. Leocadia's face drained of all color. She stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing in silent horror. She knew exactly what that EKG was. It was the data she had personally authorized to be erased. Then, the script executed its second phase. The EKG readout shrunk to the left side of the screen. On the right, a high-resolution image of a receipt materialized. It was from the Grand Hotel Stockholm, dated exactly 2 weeks prior, booked under Halcyon's name for a luxury suite. The murmurs in the crowd escalated into a chaotic buzz of confusion and shock. Before anyone could process the hotel receipt, a series of text messages overlaid the screen, perfectly synchronized with the timestamps of the altered medical files. The Phase 2 numbers are scrubbed, just like you asked. L. I can't believe we pulled this off. The board will eat it up. H. See you at the Grand Hotel tomorrow. I need to taste you again. H. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, deafening, and suffocating. It was the silence of a bomb detonating in a vacuum. Halcyon dropped the remote. It clattered loudly against the glass podium. He looked at Leocadia, panic stripping away his charm, revealing a terrified, cornered animal. Leocadia didn't look at him. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide, entirely fixed on the second row. She was looking at Gaius. Gaius sat perfectly still, his hands resting calmly in his lap. The chaotic, blinding light of their ruined lives washed over him, reflecting in his dark, unblinking eyes. He didn't sneer. He didn't gloat. He simply watched the architect of his broken marriage realize, in a crushing, agonizing wave of absolute clarity, that her clueless, supportive husband was the executioner who had just pulled the lever on her trapdoor. The silence in Hall A lasted only for a single, agonizing breath. Then, the auditorium erupted. It was not a murmur of confusion, but a roaring wave of outrage and disbelief from 2,000 of Europe's leading medical minds. The sheer audacity of the fraud, falsifying fatal cardiac data and broadcasting the motive alongside it, was unprecedented. On the stage, Halcyon was scrambling backward, his hands raised defensively, as if physically shielding himself from the damning images glaring off the LED screens. "Shut it down," he screamed into his lapel microphone, the sound shrill and panicked over the PA system. "Cut the feed. It's a hack. A vicious, targeted attack on Nordic Bio." But his words were swallowed by the rising fury of the crowd. In the front row, the CEO of Nordic Bio Pharma, a stern, silver-haired man who had practically staked his legacy on Ethelgard, stood up slowly. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying fury. He didn't look at the screen. He looked directly at Halcyon and Leocadia. "Security," the CEO barked, his voice cutting through the noise with chilling authority. "Lock the doors. Nobody leaves this hall." Leocadia remained frozen at the podium. Her hands gripped the polished glass edges so tightly her knuckles were stark white. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving violently beneath her sharp navy suit. The carefully constructed facade of the brilliant, ambitious doctor had shattered completely, leaving behind a terrified, exposed fraud. She turned her head slowly, agonizingly, toward the second row. Gaius sat there, amidst the chaos of shouting doctors and scrambling executives, a perfect island of calm. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He just watched her, his expression as unreadable and cold as the Stockholm winter outside the glass walls. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The way he had insisted on checking the AV booth. The way he had calmly asked about raw data during that agonizing dinner party. The way he had held her the night before, letting her lie about her important work and their future trip to Italy. He knew. He had known everything. She opened her mouth, a desperate, silent plea forming on her lips, but no sound came out. She was drowning in the sheer, calculated brutality of his revenge. This wasn't a divorce. This was annihilation. Within 3 minutes, the auditorium doors burst open. 4 uniformed Stockholm police officers, flanked by Nordic Bio's head of corporate security, marched down the center aisle. The medical board had already made the call. Falsifying clinical trial data involving severe, potentially fatal side effects was not just an ethical breach. It was criminal negligence and fraud on a massive scale. Dr. Halcyon, Dr. Leocadia, the lead officer announced, his voice booming over a portable bullhorn, cutting through the final murmurs of the stunned crowd. You are required to accompany us immediately. Do not attempt to leave the stage. Halcyon finally broke. He lunged toward the side stairs, a pathetic, desperate attempt to flee the inevitable. Two security guards intercepted him immediately, tackling him to the carpeted floor with a sickening thud. The brilliant, arrogant pharmacist was reduced to a struggling, shouting mess, his expensive suit rumpled and his dignity destroyed. Leocadia didn't run. She couldn't. Her legs had turned to lead. As the officers approached the podium, she sagged against the glass, her eyes never leaving Gaius. Tears finally spilled over her perfectly applied makeup, cutting jagged tracks down her pale cheeks. It was the first genuine emotion Gaius had seen from her in months. But it wasn't remorse. It was the sheer, suffocating terror of a woman realizing she had lost everything. Her career, her reputation, her freedom, and the man she had so casually discarded for a thrill. Gaius watched the officers read them their rights in rapid Swedish. He watched Halcyon being hauled to his feet, his hands secured behind his back with zip ties. He watched Leocadia being escorted down the stairs, her head bowed in absolute disgrace, the flashing blue lights of the police cruisers already visible through the high atrium windows. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel joy. The bitter victory he had fought for tasted hollow, a cold, metallic satisfaction that did nothing to heal the deep, bleeding wound in his chest. Gaius finally stood up. He smoothed the front of his charcoal suit, his movements precise and deliberate. He turned away from the stage, ignoring the chaotic buzz of the auditorium, and began to walk up the aisle toward the exit, leaving the wreckage of his marriage behind him. The Stockholm Waterfront Congress Center was a chaotic hive of flashing lights and shouting reporters by the time Gaius reached the ground floor. News of the unprecedented medical fraud had already leaked from the closed auditorium, spreading through the pharmaceutical world like a virulent infection. Gaius stood near the heavy glass doors leading to the loading dock, a quiet, unassuming figure amidst the storm he had created. He wasn't trying to escape. He was waiting. The police procedure dictated they would escort high-profile suspects out through the secure rear exit to avoid the immediate media frenzy. He didn't have to wait long. The heavy metal doors of the service elevator hissed open. Two uniformed officers stepped out first, followed by a pale, trembling Leocadia. Her hands were secured behind her back with plastic restraints. The confident, brilliant doctor who had commanded the stage just an hour ago was gone. In her place was a broken woman, her expensive navy suit rumpled, her face streaked with ruined makeup and sheer terror. Halcyon was nowhere to be seen, likely loaded into a separate transport to prevent collusion. As the officers guided her toward the loading dock doors, Leocadia looked up. She saw Gaius standing there, a few feet away, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his dark wool coat. The freezing draft from the opening doors whipped around them, a physical manifestation of the absolute coldness between them. The officers paused, perhaps sensing the electric, devastating tension. They didn't know he was the husband, only that he was a man standing in their path with the stillness of a ghost. Gaius, Leocadia choked out, her voice a ragged, desperate whisper that barely carried over the howling wind. It was the sound of a woman drowning, reaching for a lifeline she had personally severed. Please, Gaius, you have to tell them. You have to explain. Explain what? The affair? The forged EKG reports? The patients who would have died because she wanted a promotion in a luxury hotel room? Gaius didn't move toward her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her, truly looking at the hollow shell of the woman he had loved for 5 years. The anger, the white-hot rage that had sustained him through the agonizing weeks of preparation, was gone. All that remained was a profound, suffocating emptiness. He slowly withdrew his right hand from his coat pocket. Between his thumb and forefinger, he held his gold wedding band. It was a simple, elegant piece of metal that had once symbolized trust, partnership, and a shared future. Now, it felt heavy, tainted with lies and the phantom scent of Halcyon's expensive cologne. Leocadia watched the ring, a fresh sob tearing from her throat. Gaius, no? Please, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this. You meant for all of it. Gaius interrupted, his voice terrifyingly calm, cutting through her hysteria with surgical precision. You scrubbed the data, Leocadia. You signed off on a drug that would stop hearts, and you celebrated in a hotel room while you did it. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The officers tensed, but Gaius merely reached out and placed the gold band deliberately on the metal edge of a nearby security cart. The dull clink of the metal against steel echoed loudly in the cavernous loading dock. He looked into her tear-filled, horrified eyes one last time. There was no love left, only the cold, unforgiving logic of the engineer who had finally isolated the fatal flaw in the system. The numbers never lie, Leocadia, Gaius said softly, his breath pluming white in the freezing air. Neither do I. He turned his back on her before she could formulate a response, walking out the heavy glass doors into the biting Stockholm winter. The sirens of the police cruisers wailed behind him, a chaotic soundtrack to the end of his marriage. Gaius pulled his collar up against the cold, stepping onto the snow-covered pavement. He was entirely alone, scarred and exhausted, but as he walked away from the ruins of his life, he finally felt the crushing weight of her secrets lift from his shoulders.